300 students. Not one breath. Professor Thornton walked straight to row 17.
The hell are you doing in my class, boy?
Stood over the only black face in the room. Faded hoodie. Duct-taped backpack.
Name.
Blake Irving, sir.
Irving. Scholarship trash. Mama probably spread her legs to get him this far.
Wrong classroom, bro. The welfare office is across the street.
More laughter. Louder now. Thornton scrawled an equation across the board. Massive. Merciless.
Sit your black ass down before you embarrass yourself worse than your bloodline already did.
Blake stood up, walked to the front, picked up the chalk.
I'll take this one.
Nobody was laughing anymore. That single question started a war that would cost Professor Thornton his career, his reputation, and every title he'd spent 28 years collecting. Crazy, right? But here's the thing. You don't know who Blake Irving is yet. And trust me, you need to. 63rd and Halsted. That was the intersection where Blake Irving learned what numbers could do. Not in a classroom, not from a textbook, from his father. Raymond Irving worked maintenance at a printing press on the west side. Came home every night smelling like ink and machine oil, hands rough as sandpaper. But after dinner, after the dishes were done and the TV was off, he'd sit at the kitchen table with Blake and open a book. Not a children's book, not picture books with counting bears. Real books. Library discards with cracked spines and coffee stains. Algebra, trigonometry. Once, a college-level calculus textbook that a teacher at the community center had thrown away. Blake was 5 the first time he solved a quadratic equation. He didn't know what it was called, he just knew the shapes made sense, the way the numbers folded into each other, the way a problem could look impossible until you found the right angle. And then, it opened up like a door. Raymond died when Blake was 7. Heart attack on the factory floor. No insurance, no savings, just a funeral that Darlene Irving couldn't afford, paid for by a church collection, and a GoFundMe that raised $1,100. After that, the kitchen table went quiet. Darlene picked up a second shift at Mercy General. Night nurse. She'd leave at 9 and come back at 7, eyes red, feet swollen, still asking Blake if he'd eaten breakfast. She never once told him to stop reading. Never once said math wouldn't feed a family. She just put food on the table and kept the lights on and trusted her son to find his way. Blake found the library. The Harold Washington branch on State Street became his second home. He'd ride the bus after school, sit in the same chair by the window, and work through whatever book he could find. Geometry, linear algebra, probability theory. The librarian, Mrs. Palmer, started holding books for him. She didn't understand what he was reading, but she understood the look on his face when he read it. 8th grade. Blake's math teacher, Mr. Grady, assigned a state competition problem as extra credit. The problem was designed for high school seniors. Blake solved it during lunch, wrote the proof on the back of a cafeteria napkin. Mr. Grady held that napkin for a long time. Then he made some phone calls. By junior year, Blake had exhausted every math course his high school offered. Mr. Grady drove him to the University of Chicago campus on weekends to sit in on lectures. Nobody knew. Nobody at Blake's school would have believed it. The kid from 63rd and Halsted, sitting in a college auditorium, following along with graduate-level topology. The night before Blake left for Whitmore, Darlene sat on the edge of his bed. She held a small box. Inside was a watch. Raymond's watch. Silver face, cracked leather band, still ticking after all those years. "He believed in numbers too," she said. Her voice didn't crack. She wouldn't let it. Blake put the watch on. It was too loose. He wore it anyway. The next morning, he boarded a Greyhound with one suitcase, a backpack full of notebooks, and a watch that kept time 20 seconds slow. 8 hours later, he stepped onto the Whitmore campus. Stone buildings, manicured lawns, students in clothes that cost more than his mother's monthly groceries. He stood at the entrance of Whitmore Hall and looked up. Somewhere inside that building, there was a chalkboard. And on that chalkboard, eventually, there would be an equation that changed everything. Blake just didn't know it yet. Harold Thornton had a corner office on the 4th floor of Whitmore Hall. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk that weighed more than most of his students' ambitions, framed degrees from Princeton and Cambridge, awards from the American Mathematical Society, a photo of him shaking hands with a Nobel laureate at a conference in Stockholm. The room was a museum to one man's brilliance, and Thornton was both the curator and the exhibit. He'd been at Whitmore for 28 years, department chair for 12, 3 times nominated as a reviewer for the Fields Medal Committee. Not a winner, not a nominee, but close enough to the sun that the heat had permanently warped his sense of self. He published regularly, attended the right conferences, sat on the right panels. His name carried weight in academic circles, the kind of weight that came with a gravitational pull and a warning label. Students didn't take his course. They survived it. His method was simple. First lecture, scan the room, identify the weak links, apply pressure. If you couldn't handle the heat in week 1, you had no business being there in week 12. He called it rigor. Former students called it something else. Thornton doesn't teach, a third year named Watts told freshmen at orientation every September. He filters. The dropout rate for his advanced number theory class sat at 41%. Thornton wore that number like a badge. Every empty seat by November was proof that his standards meant something, that excellence required sacrifice, that only the worthy remained. But there was one thing in that office that didn't fit the narrative. Behind his desk, mounted on the wall between his Cambridge diploma and a framed letter from a colleague at Oxford, hung a whiteboard. Small, 18 by 24 inches, and on it, written in Thornton's own handwriting, now faded, smudged at the edges, was an equation. The Thornton conjecture, a problem in analytic number theory that Thornton had proposed in a paper 17 years ago. A conjecture about the distribution of prime gaps within a specific bounded sequence. Elegant in its formulation, brutal in its resistance to proof. Thornton had spent 15 years trying to crack it, filled notebooks, attended workshops, privately consulted colleagues who were too polite to tell him he was stuck. Every approach hit a wall. Every promising pathway collapsed into contradiction. He stopped working on it publicly around year 10, told people he'd moved on to other research. But that whiteboard stayed on the wall. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the building was empty and the hallway lights had flickered off, Thornton would stand in front of it, staring, hands behind his back, jaw tight. It wasn't just a math problem anymore. It was a mirror, a daily reminder that Harold Thornton, for all his titles, all his awards, all his performances at that podium, had limits. And if there was one thing Harold Thornton could not tolerate, it was being reminded of his limits, especially not by a freshman. Especially not by a freshman from the South Side. The first real test came on a Tuesday. Thornton had a ritual. Every third class, he'd call someone to the board. Not randomly. He'd study the room like a hawk circling an open field, then pick the one person who looked the least prepared, the one checking their phone, the one who glanced at the door, the one who sat too far back and thought distance meant safety. Blake always sat too far back. "Mr. Irving,"
Thornton's voice cut through the lecture hall like a knife across fabric. Clean, deliberate. "Come to the board, please." Blake stood. The chair scraped against the floor, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. 300 pairs of eyes followed him as he walked down the aisle. 17 rows. Felt like 17 miles. His sneakers squeaked against the polished wood, and somewhere in the middle rows, someone whispered something he couldn't quite hear. Thornton had written a problem on the board. Not from the textbook, not from the syllabus. It was a proof involving modular arithmetic and prime factorization, the kind of problem typically reserved for second-year graduate seminars. The kind that wasn't meant to be solved, it was meant to expose. "Since you're here on scholarship," Thornton said, adjusting his glasses with one finger, "let's see what they're giving scholarships for these days." Someone in the front row coughed. A girl in the third row stared at her desk. The room had that airless feeling, the way a room gets when everyone in it knows something cruel is happening, but nobody has the spine to say it out loud. Blake looked at the board. He picked up the chalk. His hand didn't shake. That was the first thing people noticed later, when they talked about it in the dining hall, in the study rooms, in the group chats that lit up that night. His hand didn't shake. He started writing. Slow at first, setting up the framework, defining the sets. Then faster. The chalk clicked against the slate in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. Line after line, each step clean, each transition airtight. It took him 4 minutes. When he set the chalk down, the proof was complete. Every variable accounted for. Every logical step chained to the next like links in a fence. He turned around. Thornton stared at the board. His mouth opened, then closed. He pulled his glasses off, cleaned them with his tie, put them back on, read the proof again. His jaw worked side to side, like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. The lecture hall was silent. Not uncomfortable silence this time. Stunned silence. The kind that happens when a room full of people realizes they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. "Sit down," Thornton said. Blake blinked. "Is it correct?" "I said, sit down." Thornton's voice was flat, cold, like a door slamming shut. He turned to the board, picked up the eraser, and wiped the proof away. All of it. Every line, every symbol. Gone in 3 long strokes. "Lucky guess," he said to the room. "Moving on." Blake walked back to row 17, sat down, picked up his pencil, said nothing. But something had shifted in that room. A vibration. A frequency. The kind of thing you can't point to, but everyone can feel. Like the air pressure dropping before a storm. In the second row, a girl named Ellie Chambers pulled out her phone under her desk. She'd photographed the board before Thornton erased it. She checked her notes from last semester's graduate seminar, cross-referenced the proof step by step. Every line was correct. Not just correct, elegant. Blake had found a shortcut through the proof that bypassed 2 of the standard intermediate steps, a method she'd never seen in any textbook, a method that shouldn't have come from a freshman. Ellie looked back at row 17. Blake was writing in his notebook again, head down, pencil moving, like nothing had happened. She saved the photo. After class, in the hallway, she caught up with her friend Watts, the same Watts who warned freshmen about Thornton every September. "Did you see that?" she said. "See what?" "The proof. The scholarship kids solved it." Watts shrugged. "Thornton said, lucky guess." Ellie shook her head. "That wasn't a guess. That was the cleanest modular proof I've ever seen a freshman write. And Thornton knew it. That's why he erased it." Watts looked at her, then down the hall, where Blake was walking alone toward the library, backpack slung over one shoulder, head down. "Who is that kid?" Watts said. Nobody had an answer yet, but they were starting to pay attention. After that Tuesday, Thornton changed strategy. He stopped ignoring Blake. That would have been mercy. Instead, he went the other direction. Every lecture, every problem set, every cold call, Blake first. Always Blake. Mr. Irving, since you seem to think you belong in this room, prove it. Week 2. A problem on Dirichlet series convergence. Blake solved it at the board in 3 minutes. Mr. Irving, explain the Riemann-Roch theorem as it applies to algebraic curves. Week 3. Blake spoke for 6 minutes without notes. Thornton didn't interrupt. Didn't have to. There was nothing to correct. Mr. Irving. Week 4. A proof of the infinitude of primes in arithmetic progressions. Now, Blake wrote it on the board like he was writing a letter to an old friend. Comfortable, unhurried, airtight. Each time, Thornton's face tightened a little more. The vein on the left side of his neck, the one that only appeared when he was angry, became a permanent fixture during Tuesday and Thursday lectures. The other students noticed. They started watching the exchanges, the way people watch a boxing match, where one fighter keeps landing clean shots and the other keeps pretending it doesn't hurt. Ellie kept her phone ready. She had a folder now, 12 photos of Blake's board work. She'd shown 3 of them to her father, Professor Neil Chambers in the physics department, without naming the student. "This is graduate-level work," her father had said. "Who's writing this?" A freshman. He'd stared at her over his reading glasses. "You're joking." She wasn't. By week 5, Thornton was running out of ammunition. Every problem he threw at Blake came back solved. Every trap he set got disarmed. The humiliation he'd intended for his student was boomeranging back at him, and the lecture hall could see it happening in real time. So Thornton reached for the only weapon he had left. October 17th, a Thursday. The air outside was sharp with the first bite of autumn, and the lecture hall was packed tighter than usual. Word had gotten around. People from other departments were slipping in to watch the Thornton Irving show. Thornton stood at the board. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. This equation lived in his bones, in his sleep, in the whiteboard behind his office desk that he stared at when no one was watching. He wrote it out. Slowly, deliberately. Every symbol placed with the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years failing to conquer this exact sequence of numbers. The Thornton conjecture. When he finished, he turned to face the class. But his eyes went straight to row 17. "This," he said, "is what real mathematics looks like. Not textbook exercises, not homework problems. This is an open conjecture in analytic number theory, unsolvable by anyone in this room." He paused. Let the words land. "I doubt anyone here, especially those on financial aid, could even understand the question." A few students shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled hard through their nose. The insult wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Blake looked at the board. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't glare. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, a beat-up Android with a cracked screen. He held it up and took a photo of the equation. The shutter sound was the loudest thing in the room. Thornton saw it. His eyes narrowed. "Something interesting, Mr. Irving?" Blake put his phone away. "Just taking notes, sir." Thornton held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned back to the lecture. He didn't know it yet. Couldn't have imagined it. The equation he'd written on that board, the one he'd used as a weapon, a wall, a monument to his own superiority, had just been handed to the one person in the world who could tear it apart. And Blake was already thinking. That night, Blake sat on his dorm room floor, no desk. His roommate, a business major named Cooper, who'd never once asked what Blake was studying, had claimed the only desk on move-in day. Blake didn't argue. He worked on the floor, always had. Kitchen table, library chair, dormitory carpet. The surface didn't matter. The numbers did. He opened his phone, pulled up the photo, zoomed in until the equation filled the crack screen. The Thornton conjecture.
He'd recognized its shape the moment Thornton wrote it on the board. Not the specific problem, he'd never seen it published anywhere, but the structure, the pattern underneath the symbols. It was a question about the gaps between prime numbers within a bounded interval. How they clustered, how they thinned, whether their distribution followed a predictable asymptotic formula when filtered through a specific sieve.
Blake started sketching on a legal pad. Yellow paper, blue ink. His handwriting got smaller as the ideas got bigger. By midnight, he'd filled 6 pages, 3 approaches, all dead ends. He went to the library. The Harold Washington branch was 8 hours away now, so Whitmore's Sterling Library would have to do. 3rd floor, mathematics section. The same chair every night, back corner, near the fire exit, under a lamp that buzzed at a frequency only he seemed to notice.
He pulled Ivanets and Kowalski off the shelf, then Hardy and Wright, then Tao's lecture notes on additive combinatorics, printed from a PDF and stapled at the campus copy center. Days passed. Blake stopped eating at regular hours. A granola bar at 2 a.m. Coffee from the vending machine. The kind that tasted like hot water filtered through cardboard. His roommate, Cooper, started leaving snacks on Blake's pillow without saying a word. Small kindnesses from someone who didn't understand what was happening, but could feel its weight. On night 4, Blake called Mr. Grady. It was 11:30 on a school night. Mr. Grady answered on the second ring. He always did. "I'm stuck on a sieve method," Blake said. No hello, no small talk. Mr. Grady was used to it. "Walk me through it." Blake talked for 40 minutes. Mr. Grady listened, asked 2 questions. Both of them were the right questions. Not answers, but the kind of nudges that redirected Blake's thinking, like a compass finding north. "What if the sieve isn't the tool?" Mr. Grady said quietly. "What if you need to go around it?" Blake hung up, stared at the ceiling. Then he grabbed his notebook and started from scratch. Night 7, night 8. The pages piled up. Blake's eyes were bloodshot. His hoodie smelled like library carpet and vending machine coffee. But something was forming. A shape in the fog. An approach that nobody had tried because it shouldn't have worked. Combining methods from algebraic topology with analytic number theory. 2 fields that rarely spoke to each other. Night 11, 2:14 in the morning. Sterling Library was empty. The lamp buzzed. Blake's pen stopped moving. He stared at the page, read it back, read it again, then a 3rd time, slower, checking every step against every axiom he knew. It held. Every line, every transition, every leap of logic landed exactly where it needed to. The proof was unconventional, ugly even by textbook standards, but it was complete, and it was correct. Blake set his pen down. His hands were trembling, not from nerves, from exhaustion. 11 days of 4-hour sleep and floor sitting and bad coffee. He pulled out his phone and texted Ellie Chambers. They'd exchanged numbers the week before, after she'd caught him studying in the library, and asked what he was working on. The text was 3 words. "I got something." Ellie didn't respond until morning, but when she did, it was just a thumbs-up emoji and a time. 8 a.m., 3rd floor, their usual corner. She didn't know yet what Blake had done. Nobody did. Blake arrived at Whitmore Hall at 6:15 in the morning. The building was locked. He waited by the side entrance, leaning against the brick wall, breath fogging in the October cold. A janitor named Eddie let him in at 6:30. Same guy who'd been opening doors for early bird students since before Blake was born. "You're here early, son."
Got something to finish?" Eddie nodded, didn't ask questions. Some people just have a look about them when they're carrying something heavy, and Eddie had been around long enough to recognize it.
Blake walked into Lecture Hall C. The room was empty. The overhead lights were off. Morning sun came through the tall windows on the east side, throwing long gold rectangles across the tiered seats and the wooden floor. He set his backpack down on the front table, pulled out his notebook, pulled out 4 sticks of chalk. He'd bought them from the campus bookstore the day before, white, dustless, the good kind. And he started writing. The chalkboard in Lecture Hall C was 12 feet wide. Blake used every inch. He began at the top left corner. The conjecture first, restated in his own notation, cleaned up, compressed. Then the setup, the definitions, the lemmas he'd need, each one proven in miniature, stacked like stepping stones across a river. Then the core argument, the topology bridge. This was the part that would make people stop, the part where Blake took tools from one branch of mathematics and carried them carefully, precisely, into another branch where they had no business being, and made them work. The chalk clicked. The numbers flowed. His handwriting was small and exact, the way it always was. Tight letters, clean symbols, no wasted space. The proof filled the board from left to right, top to bottom, like a page from a book nobody had written yet. It took him 47 minutes. When he finished, he set the chalk down on the tray, stepped back, read the whole thing from beginning to end. Then he picked up his backpack and left. The first students arrived at 7:45. Most of them walked in looking at their phones, half awake, still carrying coffee. But one by one, they looked up. And one by one, they stopped. The board was covered. Not with a lecture, not with a homework problem, with something dense, something intricate, something that looked like it had taken a lifetime to produce. A second year named Harris pulled out his phone and started filming. A girl in the 4th row, a graduate student auditing the class, whispered, "Is that a proof of Thornton's conjecture?" Word spread fast. By 8 o'clock, there were people standing in the doorway, students from other sections. A teaching assistant from the topology department who'd heard about it through a group chat. Ellie Chambers was there, leaning against the wall near the back, arms crossed, the faintest trace of a smile on her face. Then Thornton arrived. He walked in carrying his leather briefcase and a coffee cup from the faculty lounge. He set the briefcase on his desk, took a sip of coffee. Then he looked up. The cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared at the board. His lips moved slightly, reading. His coffee hand lowered. The room went completely still. Thornton walked to the board, slowly, like a man approaching something he wasn't sure was real. He stood 3 feet from the chalk and read every line. His eyes tracked left to right, top to bottom. He went back to the beginning, read it again. His face drained of color, not embarrassment, recognition. He was seeing, in a freshman's handwriting, the answer to a question that had haunted him for 15 years. And the answer was right. He knew it was right because he'd tried every wrong approach. He'd mapped every dead end. He could see, line by line, how this proof avoided every trap he'd fallen into. Not by brute force, but by elegance. By seeing the problem from an angle Thornton had never once considered. He put his coffee down, picked up the eraser. Then he stopped. The room was watching. Every eye in the hall, every phone camera, every breath held. Thornton set the eraser down. "Who wrote this?" he said. His voice didn't sound like authority anymore. It sounded like a man who'd just been handed a mirror and didn't like what he saw. Nobody answered. Thornton did what cornered men do. He attacked. By noon that same day, a formal complaint had been filed with the Office of Academic Integrity. The charge? Plagiarism. The accused? Blake Irving, first-year student, scholarship recipient, suspected of copying an unpublished proof from an unknown external source.
The complaint was 6 pages long. Thornton had typed it himself, single-spaced, with citations to university policy and a reference to the implausibility of a student of Mr. Irving's background producing work of this caliber independently. Background. That word again, the word that followed Blake like a shadow through every hallway of this campus. Dean Catherine Wells read the complaint in her office that afternoon. She read it twice, took off her glasses, put them back on. Then she called Thornton. "Harold, you're telling me a freshman solved your conjecture, and your first instinct is to accuse him of cheating?" "It's not possible," Thornton said. His voice carried the stiffness of a man who hadn't been questioned in years. "The mathematics involved requires years of specialized training. The student has no published work, no research history, no faculty mentor, no prior exposure to this level of analytic number theory. So your argument is that he couldn't have done it because he shouldn't have been able to?" Silence. Dean Wells set the complaint on her desk. "Here's what's going to happen. We'll convene a panel, 3 faculty members from the mathematics department, plus 1 external reviewer. Mr. Irving will be given the opportunity to reproduce or explain the proof in person. If he can, the complaint is dismissed. If he can't, we proceed with the integrity review. And when he fails?" "If he fails," Wells corrected. "We'll cross that bridge when we reach it." The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Room 201, Whitmore Hall, a seminar room built for 30. By Wednesday night, the university had moved it to the main auditorium. The demand for seats was that high. Students, faculty, even 2 local journalists who'd caught wind of the story through a math department group chat that someone had screenshotted and posted online. Blake found out about the plagiarism charge through an email, a formal university email with his name, his student ID, and the words "academic dishonesty" in the subject line. He read it sitting on the floor of his dorm room, his back against the wall, the phone screen lighting up his face in the dark. Cooper, his roommate, looked over from his desk. "You okay?" Blake locked the phone. "Fine." He wasn't fine. He called Mr. Grady that night, told him everything. The conjecture, the proof, the charge, the hearing. Mr. Grady was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing. I just needed someone to know the truth before I walk in there." "I've always known, Blake. Since the napkin." Blake didn't sleep that night. He sat on the floor with his notebook open, going through the proof one more time. Not because he doubted it, because he wanted to be ready, because he knew that room wouldn't just be a math test. It would be a trial. And the verdict had already been decided in Thornton's mind. Meanwhile, Ellie Chambers was doing research of her own. She'd found something. Buried in the Whitmore Digital Archives, a faculty newsletter from 9 years ago. In it, a brief mention of Thornton presenting progress on his conjecture at a department colloquium. The newsletter included a summary of his approach, a classical analytic method using Selberg sieves. Then she found another reference, a conference abstract from 7 years ago. Same conjecture, same approach, same dead end. Then a third, a grant application from 5 years ago. Thornton had requested funding to continue work on the conjecture. The application was denied. The reviewer's note read, "The proposed method has been exhausted. No new ideas presented." Ellie printed all 3 documents. She put them in a manila folder. She didn't know yet if Blake would need them, but she knew what they meant. Thornton hadn't filed a plagiarism complaint because he believed Blake had cheated. He'd filed it because Blake had succeeded where Thornton had failed. And that was a kind of humiliation no title, no tenure, no corner office could absorb. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. Blake put on a clean shirt, the only button-down he owned. White, slightly wrinkled, bought at a thrift store on 63rd Street the summer before college. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. Then he looked at his father's watch on his wrist. 20 seconds slow. Still ticking. He grabbed his notebook. One notebook. No lawyer, no advisor, no faculty sponsor. He walked out the door. Nah, hold on. A professor filed plagiarism charges because a black kid from the South Side solved something he couldn't? Imagine that's you. Imagine sitting in that room, knowing you're right, and the whole system says you're a cheater. One notebook, no lawyer. Would you walk in? The auditorium in Whitmore Hall seated 412 people. Every seat was taken by 8:45. Another 60 stood along the back wall and in the aisles. Campus security had to close the doors at 8:55. The panel sat at a long table on the stage. 3 mathematics faculty members, Dr. Louise Penner, an algebraist known for her precision and her refusal to suffer fools. Dr. Victor Nash, a number theorist who'd published with Thornton twice and owed him nothing anymore. Dr. Sandra Cole, the newest hire in the department, young enough to still believe in fairness and old enough to know how rare it was. And the external reviewer, Professor Alan Mercer. MIT, one of the top 5 analytic number theorists on the planet. Graybeard, rumpled blazer, the kind of man who looked like he'd wandered in from a coffee shop, but could dismantle your life's work with a single question. Mercer hadn't planned to be there. He'd been visiting Whitmore for a guest lecture on random matrix theory. When Dean Wells called and explained the situation, he'd said yes before she finished the sentence. Thornton sat in the front row, arms crossed, jaw set. He looked like a man waiting to be proven right. Blake walked in at 9 o'clock sharp, white shirt, notebook under his arm, his father's watch on his wrist. He looked at the auditorium, 400 faces, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, his step faltered. Then he kept walking. Dean Wells opened the proceedings. Formal, measured. She explained the charge, the process, the rules. Blake would be given the chalkboard. He could present his proof in its entirety. The panel would evaluate. Questions would follow. Mr. Irving, she said, the floor is yours. Blake set his notebook on the podium, opened it, then closed it. He wouldn't need it. He'd gone through this proof so many times, it lived inside him like a second heartbeat. He picked up the chalk. He started with the conjecture, restated it cleanly. His voice was low, but steady, carrying across the auditorium with a clarity that surprised even him. He defined his terms, set the boundaries, established the notation. Then he began the proof. The first section was standard, familiar ground. The panel followed along, nodding. Thornton watched with narrow eyes, waiting for the stumble, waiting for the gap, the moment where the fraud would reveal itself. It didn't come. Blake moved into the second section, the sieve construction. This was where Thornton's own approach had died, trapped in the limitations of classical analytic methods. Blake acknowledged those limitations, named them, then walked right past them. Dr. Penner leaned forward. Her pen stopped moving. The third section was the bridge, the topology argument. Blake took a deep breath and began explaining how a continuous mapping between 2 topological spaces could be used to encode information about prime distribution in a bounded interval. It was unorthodox. It was audacious. It was the kind of move that either collapses under scrutiny or reshapes a field. The auditorium was silent. Not polite silence. Awed silence.
The silence of people watching someone do something they didn't think was possible. Dr. Victor Nash removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back. A nervous habit, but his face wasn't nervous. It was something else, something closer to wonder.
Blake kept writing. The chalk filled the board. When he ran out of space, a graduate student jumped up and rolled in a second board. Blake didn't pause. He transitioned seamlessly, his voice never wavering, his handwriting never faltering. The fourth section. The convergence argument. The point where the proof either holds or shatters. It held. Every step locked into the next. Every assumption was grounded. Every leap was justified. The logic was airtight, and the room could feel it. That unmistakable sensation when something true is being spoken aloud for the first time. Blake set the chalk down, turned to face the panel. His hands were white with dust. His shirt had a chalk smudge on the left cuff. His father's watch caught the overhead light. "That concludes the proof," he said. Silence. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. Then Professor Alan Mercer stood up. Not slowly, not dramatically. He stood up the way a person stands up when something has hit them so hard they can't stay seated. "This isn't just a proof," Mercer said. His voice was rough, quiet. The microphone barely caught it. "This is a new framework. The topological bridge you've constructed has implications far beyond this conjecture. You've opened a door that I'm not sure anyone in this room, including myself, fully appreciates yet." He looked at Blake, directly at Blake, eye to eye.
"How old are you?" 18, sir." Mercer shook his head. Not in disbelief, in recognition. The way a man shakes his head when he sees something beautiful and can't find the right words for it. Dr. Penner started clapping, then Dr. Cole, then Nash, then the first row, then the second, then the back wall, then the aisles. The auditorium erupted.
400 people on their feet. Applause that shook the walls of Whitmore Hall. A sound that carried through the doors and down the corridor and out into the October morning, where a janitor named Eddie looked up from his mop and smiled, even though he had no idea what had just happened inside. Blake stood at the board, chalk dust on his hands, his father's watch on his wrist. He didn't look at Thornton. He didn't need to. The panel deliberated for 11 minutes. It would have been faster, but Dr. Penner insisted on verifying 2 of the topological lemmas by hand before signing her name to anything. She was that kind of thorough. When they returned, Dean Wells read the decision aloud. "The charge of academic dishonesty against Blake Irving is dismissed in its entirety. The panel finds, unanimously, that the proof presented is original work of exceptional quality." Blake exhaled, just once.
Then he closed his notebook and put the cap back on his pen. Thornton didn't move. He sat in the front row with his hands on his knees, staring at a point on the floor that didn't exist. The auditorium was still buzzing, people shaking Blake's hand, professors exchanging looks, graduate students crowding the chalkboard with their phones. But Thornton sat perfectly still, like a man watching a building he'd spent his life constructing fold inward on itself.
Dean Wells wasn't finished. Within 48 hours, the university opened a formal review of Thornton's conduct, not just the plagiarism complaint. Everything. Ellie Chambers delivered her manila folder to the dean's office that same afternoon. The grant denial, the conference abstracts, the 15-year timeline of failure on the very conjecture he'd used to humiliate Blake. But the folder wasn't what broke the case open. It was the other students. Once the hearing ended, they started talking. One by one. Then in groups. Stories that had been swallowed for semesters came pouring out. A Latina student who'd been told her accent meant she thought slowly. A first-generation student from Appalachia who'd been publicly mocked for asking a question about notation. 3 international students who'd received suspiciously low grades after challenging Thornton's interpretation of a theorem in class. The pattern was clear. Thornton hadn't targeted Blake because he was a bad student. He'd targeted Blake because Blake was everything Thornton feared. Brilliance without pedigree. Talent without permission. Excellence that didn't pass through his gate. The review board met twice. Thornton was suspended with pay pending the outcome. 2 weeks later, before the board could issue its final report, Thornton submitted his resignation. No public statement, no interview. He cleared his office on a Sunday morning when the building was empty. The mahogany desk stayed. The awards stayed. The whiteboard with his faded conjecture stayed. He took his briefcase and his coffee mug and left through the side door. Nobody saw him go. 3 days after the hearing, Professor Mercer called Blake into his temporary office on the Whitmore campus. He'd extended his visit specifically for this meeting. "I want you at MIT," Mercer said. No preamble, no small talk. Full research fellowship. You'll work directly with my group. We study exactly the kind of structures you used in your proof. Topological methods in number theory. It's a new field, and as of last Thursday, you're one of the people who invented it. Blake sat in the chair across from Mercer's desk. He didn't say anything for a long time. "I need to call my mom first," he said. Mercer smiled. "Take your time." Blake called Darlene that evening from a bench outside the library, the same library where he'd spent 11 nights solving the impossible. The October air had turned cold, and his breath came out in small, white clouds. "Mom, baby, what happened? Tell me everything," he told her. All of it. The hearing, the standing ovation, the MIT offer. Darlene Irving was silent on the other end for a long time. Then she made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, something in between, something that only mothers know how to make. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "He'd be so, so proud." Blake looked down at the watch on his wrist, the cracked leather band, the silver face. Still 20 seconds slow. Still ticking. "I know, Mom." 2 weeks later, Darlene flew to Whitmore, her first time on an airplane. Blake picked her up at the campus shuttle stop. She was wearing her church dress and carrying a Tupperware container of sweet potato pie. She hugged him so hard his feet almost left the ground. They walked across the campus together, past Whitmore Hall, past the auditorium where everything had changed. Darlene stopped and looked up at the stone building. "This is where it happened?" Blake nodded. She squeezed his hand. "Show me the chalkboard," she said. 3 years later, Cambridge, Massachusetts. A summer morning so humid the air felt like it had weight. Blake Irving stood at the front of a classroom at MIT. Not a lecture hall, a small room, 12 desks, whiteboards on 3 walls, a window that looked out onto the Charles River, where rowing crews carved lines through the gray water. The students sitting in those desks were between 14 and 17 years old. 6 from Chicago, 2 from Detroit, 1 from Newark, 1 from rural Mississippi, 1 from the Bronx, 1 from a reservation in South Dakota. The Summer Bridge program in advanced mathematics. Blake had designed it himself, funded by a grant he'd written with Professor Mercer's help, open to students from underrepresented communities who showed exceptional promise in math but had no access to advanced instruction. Blake opened every session the same way. Mathematics doesn't care where you come from. He'd say it quietly, not as a speech, not as a slogan, just as a fact. The same way you'd say the sky is blue or water runs downhill. Then he'd hand out the problems, Hard problems. Real problems. The kind of problems that made you stare at the ceiling at 2 in the morning and question everything you thought you knew. The kind that broke you open and rebuilt you stronger. He didn't filter. He didn't rank. He didn't scan the room for weak links. He taught. Ellie Chambers was there too. Not in the classroom. She was down the hall, running the program's research track. She'd finished her doctorate the year before, specializing in algebraic topology. Her dissertation cited Blake's proof 3 times. They'd published 2 papers together and argued about notation in every single one. Mr. Grady came to visit once, near the end of the summer session. He flew in from Chicago, his first trip to the East Coast. Blake picked him up at Logan Airport. They drove to campus in silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who've known each other long enough that words are optional. Mr. Grady sat in the back of Blake's classroom for an hour, watched the students work, watched Blake move between desks, crouching down to eye level, pointing at a line of proof, asking the right question at the right time. Afterward, in the hallway, Mr. Grady shook his head. "You know what I remember?" he said. "A napkin. 8th grade. Back of a cafeteria napkin." Blake laughed. "That napkin was terrible." "That napkin changed your life." "No," Blake said. "You changed my life. The napkin was just paper." Mr. Grady looked at him for a long time. Then he squeezed Blake's shoulder and walked away before his eyes could give him away. The Thornton conjecture is no longer called the Thornton conjecture. In the most recent edition of 3 major number theory textbooks, it appears under a new name, the Irving proof. Thornton's name appears once in a footnote. Originally conjectured by H. Thornton, 2009. No further context, no biography, no legacy. Just a footnote and a date. Blake never spoke publicly about Thornton, never gave an interview about the hearing, never posted about it. When a journalist from the Boston Globe asked him about it for a profile piece, Blake said only one thing. The math speaks for itself. He still wears his father's watch. The leather band has been replaced twice, but the face is the same. Silver, slightly scratched, still running 20 seconds slow. He doesn't fix it. He says it reminds him that time isn't the point. The work is the point. Showing up is the point. Solving the problem is the point. Not when you solve it, but that you solve it at all. Every morning, before the students arrive, Blake stands alone in his classroom. He looks at the whiteboards, clean, blank, waiting. And for a moment, just a moment, he's back on 63rd and Halsted. Kitchen table. Blue ink on yellow paper. His father's voice in his ear. Numbers don't lie, Blake. People do. But numbers never do. Then the door opens, the students file in, and Blake Irving picks up his chalk. So here's the question, and I want you to really think about this. Who in your life told you that you didn't belong? Who looked at you and decided what you could or couldn't do before you even opened your mouth? Drop it in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Blake's story today. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because this channel, we tell the stories that the world tries to keep quiet. Yo, real talk. They called his mom a whore. Called him quota trash. Told him to sit his black ass down. And this kid picked up the chalk and rewrote the whole damn textbook. Imagine someone said that to your face. What would you do? Blake chose math. Math won.